Hi.
Hello there. Hello there. So this is Tete.Depunk, and today we're going to be interviewing Fortunate Games. Fortunate Games is currently working on Sam in New York, which is a multimedia project in the form of a visual novel and a webtoon comic. Sam in New York tells the story of a young man trying to discover his purpose in life as he is torn between his parents' desire for him to be a lawyer and his own love of the stage. So we were discussing about historical fiction and the research that it involves. And of course, we're furthering expanding this discussion that you had with Helleborn. And then in our previous session together, when we were talking about the development of Gleb and Petya and their father. So I imagine we have a few questions that the audience would probably like to hear your take on. The first question is, what is your approach to tackling historical fiction? Do you tend to focus on gathering facts before you begin writing the story, or do you prefer writing the story and researching the facts to fit into the story?
I think it's like a bit of both. For Sam in New York, I think what I really focused on initially was the setting because back in 2017, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with the story. I pretty much only had the concept of Sam and his parents as characters, and I just really wanted to look into the story and in the setting that it takes place in. So I did the gathering of facts first and basically focused on more on the academic essays about the time period as well as like primary resources about that time period, especially Yiddish theater, which I found really fascinating. So I gathered all of these facts before thinking about how I can approach the story and where the plot will go, because back in 2017 I didn't know where the plot was going. It was just really basically a bunch of anecdotes about how this young man was growing up on the Lower East Side. But now in 2020, especially after the Webtoon short story contest, I have a better idea of where I'm going. And I have collected a lot of ideas about what the visual novel will be about and what the Webtoon will be about. So it's really about absorbing all the information you've gathered over the past few years and then basically just kind of like immersing yourself in that world until you kind of absorb all the information, so you don't even need to do that much more research. You just write the story, and then if you come to an area of the story where you do need to do more research, you do the research, basically building on the foundation you've already laid down for yourself.
So essentially, it's almost an organic process, almost like, you absorb it by osmosis of study and immersing yourself into that time period and setting.
I think so, yes.
Right. The second question is, what are the challenges of finding accurate sources regarding the people and location itself?
I think what one of the challenges is that what I'm writing about is rather niche, I would say. There's not that much information about certain Yiddish plays. I had to look very deep to find like even one sentence about what they were about. And oftentimes it's very, very basic. There's not a lot of information about what exactly went on in some of those plays. So I think I have the creative license to kind of brainstorm about what it would be about. Because in general, for example, a lot of people were saying that Yiddish theater reflected a lot of what the immigrants were thinking about in their own lives, their own struggles in America. So, I can kind of take creative license about what a particular Yiddish play was about.
Right, right. So, especially when people face that challenge of having, they're researching something that's niche, then, in your view, creative license is permitted as long as it kind of follows a logical development, as long as you don't go off on a tangent or add anything anachronistic, then creative license is then permitted.
I think so, yes.
Right.
Especially, in something like Sam in New York, which is really about creativity, performativity, and, discovery of the self. I think there can be more, creative license taken with a work like Sam in New York than in some other, more strictly historical works.
Right, right, because Sam in New York isn't strictly historical, it's more of a human experience,
Hmm.
flow of consciousness story. Right.
Exactly. it's
Right.
pretty character driven. I would say that even if we do change the setting to like 2020, not that much would be changed about the characters
Right.
in
That's very
general. I mean,
essentially.
other than their occupation and their education, I mean, more people would be going to university. But other than that, I don't really think there would be that much of a difference. Sam's struggles will probably still be the same.
Right, right. That's what sort of makes it timeless and relatable to your audience, you know. Um, and speaking of flow of consciousness and things being character driven, that leads us to our third question, which is how do you integrate flow of consciousness and other modernist techniques into historical fiction? Because historical fiction is often seen as kind of like a pageant with costumes or just focused on events and such. How do you make that flow of consciousness and put in those, you know, other modernist, you know, techniques employed in there?
I think what I do is basically focus on the character himself. As I've said before, Sam is the focus of Sam in New York, whether it's the webtoon or the visual novel. So by focusing on Sam himself as a person rather than as a historical, focus on the modifier, historical character, I think we can end up focusing more on his inner journey and what I seek to achieve with the series, which is to kind of make people think about what they want in life and what is meaningful in their own lives. And this is all subjective, right? Sam's story is about him discovering what matters to him the most in each of the different routes he explores in the visual novel. So he can end up becoming a lawyer, or he can end up being something else, or he can end up being an actor. And there's also a wide variety of love interests that he can also end up with, each of whom, elucidates a different aspect of his personality and his inner struggles.
That makes sense. And that's a very brilliant way, you know, to approach something because I think a lot of people struggle with reading historical fiction because it can often feel like fantasy. It can often feel like a lifeless pageantry of just visuals or actions or plot. But this is a very interesting approach and take. I think it adds more depth and humanity. Um, and, you know, it certainly feels more like a human story than just solely a historical fiction. It's a human story that just happens to take place in a time period.
Exactly, yeah. And also
Right.
because, Sam's story is also focused on how he sees the world around him. And I think this is rather timeless. And especially since this is in the modern period, in the 1920s, there's not, I think, that much difference. If it was like the Middle Ages, I think it would be a lot more difficult because in the Middle Ages, people were much more survivalist minded. And it was much more violence. Violence was much like very normalized in those time periods, and people had different expectations in life. People weren't relying on a job to get themselves fed. A lot of them were farmers, they were hunters, etc. So like it's a different lifestyle because the historical period in which Sam in New York is set is more similar to our own. We can see more parallels.
Right, right. And I mean, that sort of leads to kind of a subsection of a question. Um, you know, do you feel like, for example, probably you've answered this question, but do you feel like time and place affect the relatability of a narrative that you can create for a character?
I think so, definitely. Time and place are very important because they also, kind of shape the character and what kind of experience he, she, or they could have experienced. And, that really shapes the course of the story, especially if your story is a very character focused one. If it's a less character focused one, like, for example, the 2017 movie Dunkirk, which is like, a kind of like a filmmaking exercise in which you don't really see into the minds of any of the soldiers. You just kind of hover and see their lives from the outside. And they're all pretty much nameless and we don't know their stories. I mean, that's a different kind of feel that than what I'm exploring in Semi New York. In fact, quite the opposite.
Right, right. So essentially, you know, that's a very great example, Dunkirk, because it is, you know, taking place in a, you know, almost, you know, 3 to 5 years, you know, before Sam's timeline. Um, and at the
Isn't it World
same
War
time,
II?
wait, Dunkirk wasn't that World War One?
I'm pretty sure the movie was about World War II.
Oh, okay. I apologize for that. Um,
Yeah, sorry, I was confused for a second because I don't really remember it. Was it World War One or World War II? I think it was World War II.
I think you're right. I'll have to like Google it later, but I think you're right. But yes, I mean, essentially, it does show that, when you do focus on the outside of just historical events happening, um, then you begin to lose connection with characters. So it is nice to see a story that isn't its sole focus isn't historical, chronicling events, tidbits, minutia, but rather than just the human experience, which makes it all the more timeless.
I think so, yes.
Right, right. Our fourth question is that actually leads to our fourth question. How do you create a story that isn't molded by the events of that time period? Like, how do you have something that's more, organic? You can shape it more, to fit a timeless human experience that isn't like constricted by the time events or constrictions of that, social time period.
Hmm. I think it really depends on what time period you end up choosing, but the more different it is from our current one, I think the more difficult it would be to create a story that isn't molded by the events of the time period.
Right, right. So, like you were saying, if you were to write Sam in New York in the medieval ages, it probably would not even come to be because, I mean, you know what I mean? It would just be impossible, because some narratives you can't, transpose onto different eras because that would equate something entirely different.
Indeed, yeah. I'm not really sure how I would tackle it in the Middle Ages.
Right, right. So how would you say like for your future works, do you plan on doing things, of a historical nature, like modern century, or do you plan to focus on like postmodern, like currently, like just
I
to,
think, oh, sorry.
oh, no, oh, yeah, for timelessness. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So, I think in general, I would probably focus on either 20th century stuff or stuff that's happening right now.
Right, right. And also because you're able to immerse the human experience much better because it's something that you as a creator can understand, and you don't have to think with a different mindset for like different social conventions, and just the way the world is. You're writing about the now world, so to speak.
Indeed, yeah. I think that's one of the things. And, it saves me some work. And I think just from my perspective, the modern world and the 20th century and all the developments that happened during the 20th century have always interested me more than anything that took place a longer time ago. I think it stems from the fact that I took a lot of courses in university that were about modern history, and I always like to think about what's the impact of history on our current lives. And a lot of the things that interest me, like identity, diaspora, colonialism, stuff like that, that all happened mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Right, right, that's very true. I think one thing, I think one more, like subsection of question. What advice would you give to people who want to write historical fiction, but maybe they want to, take place in a further removed time period and place? How would you advise them to make it relatable to readers? How would you tell them to find that common universal human experience?
I think that's a very good question. And I think maybe Hellevorn would be a better answerer because she works a lot with, medieval characters and the medieval setting. And from what I gleaned from the conversation that I had with her, I think what we need to keep in mind is that people are still the same no matter what age that we are. We haven't changed that much, and evolution doesn't happen that quickly in the past, like 1,000 years or 2,000 years, right? So
Right, right.
I would say that for time periods that are more removed from our own, we would first have to look at what are the main preoccupations of that time period. What would make people from that time period different from us? like, what kind of occupations would they have, or if they did have occupations, what kind of concerns would they have, and how would that translate to our current society. Yes, some of the things will be very different, but at the same time, there's many things that are pretty much the same. And their lifespans would also be reduced. So what we consider young may be considered middle-aged in that time period as well. So ages may have to be changed. For example, Sam would be considered not young at age 25 in, I don't know,
Right.
medieval Germany, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very
Yeah.
good point. I suppose another subsection of question would be, what would you, like, for example, uh, how would you advise writers and creators and artists and such, when they're storytelling and they're doing a historical period? How would you advise them how to avoid anachronism? Do you feel like anachronism ruins the story, like it ruins the integrity of the story? Or do you feel that in some certain cases anachronism is allowed?
I think it's subjective. I mean, a lot of stories are more or less kind of like fantastical in some sense, even though it's historical. There might be, like, for example, elements of the unreliable narrator, right? Or it could
Right,
be
right.
written from the perspective of someone who's not even from that time period. For example, like maybe there's a book, like it looks like a typical historical fiction where you think the narrator is from the same time period as the characters, but maybe at the end it's revealed that he's actually a writer from the modern period, and he's piecing these people's stories together, as a thought experiment, or maybe it's because these people are his ancestors and he wants to research them.
Right, right. So essentially, it is subjective, so therefore it can be allowed. Should the writer make like a disclaimer for that in case people may want to say, oh, this was, not entirely accurate, or I found this out of place? Do you think they need to worry about that, or should they just go ahead and just go with it and not bother to put a disclaimer about any anachronism and anachronisms?
I think, going back on my points, it just depends on what kind of narrative it is. If it is the kind of narrative where there is a very unreliable narrator, I don't think there's like, it's not necessary for you to have a footnote, because the whole entire point of the narrative is for the reader to figure out what is reliable and what is not. But if it's like a more
Right.
straightforward traditional way of writing where there is no unreliable narrator, maybe, yeah, I think it would be good to, like, put a footnote and say, yeah, no, this is something that I thought of, I'm not really sure if any sources prove this, the more traditional kind of historical writing that's more, academically based and more factual.
Right, right. That's very good advice. What would you say to creators who are, maybe, have some trepidations about, they want to make everything entirely accurate, right down to the very minute details? Would you would you would you advise them that they need to be concerned about that, or would you advise them not to, just to put it bluntly, sweat over the small stuff and focus on the bigger picture instead?
I think, generally speaking, I think it's better to just focus on the bigger picture, especially since, if you're writing your first draft and you have a deadline, it's better to basically just have everything down, all of your ideas and the plot down before you fix any of the smaller details.
Right, right. That's actually very good advice, because there's so many people, like even myself included, who just used to sweat over the small stuff and just worry, oh my goodness, do I know about what kind of spoons they used or something?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, very good advice on that point. I suppose the last subset of questions is, um, like, do you feel that it's do you feel like if you're going to have a historical event maybe affect the character, do you think it's important to get, focus on the event that's shaping them, or, focusing the character itself that's experiencing the event, sort of like just kind of ignoring the facts happening around them, like the little details of that?
I'm not really sure. I think it really depends on what you want to achieve with your book and the character, right? Can you be a
Right.
little bit more specific?
I would say, okay, for example, if somebody's going through, say a specific, event during a wartime period, should you be focusing on details like, like food shortages, or, what was the oncoming, like this army's coming in to evade a city or something, or should, you just have that in passing and just think about how that's affecting the character's emotional state and other things.
I think you should include a little bit of what's happening, but maybe you can incorporate it better into the narrative by having someone tell this to the character or having the character read it somewhere.
Right, right. Then that way it's like you're experiencing it with them. You're not just, blankly putting it out there
Hmm.
in blank verse, in
Yeah.
blank prose, so to speak.
Hmm.
Right, right. So how would you say the how would you say, like, when doing the research for Sam in New York in its different forms, um, how would you say the research, helped you not only as a researcher but also as a creator? Like, did it help you expand to think more about different things and approach things differently? Um, and if so, would that have happened if you hadn't been prompted to do the research?
Hmm. I think, can you rephrase the question again? Sorry, I'm just
Okay.
really tired tonight. It's
Oh,
just
no, no,
really,
that's
yeah.
okay. Yeah, even I'm a little tired, and I'm kind of trying to figure out what I want to say. Would you think that researching the stuff for Sam in New York, do you think that helped you as a creator how to approach things differently, like a story differently, like characterization differently because you did research? Or do you think your writing approach would have stayed the same regardless of whether or not you did research?
Hmm. I think it would have pretty been the same because the focus was always on Sam and his journey. And I always kind of saw the historical research as just kind of like background dressing.
Right, right. So it's a little bit different from what happened with me, was that the more I did research, the more it challenged me as a creator to improve better and be willing to, like, compromise, like not just to fit, my own narrative, but, create something. Like I said, once you kind of compromise, like in my case, you get better things. So it's different in your case because your writing approach and such is a constant, and everything else is just, background dressing, so to speak.
Hmm. I think so. I think what really changed Sammy New York in general isn't research, but my own lived experiences. As I grow as a person and, as I think through more things like thought experiments and all the things that I think about usually, I think they have really influenced how I approach the characters and how I want them to develop.
That's a wonderful thing to discuss about, because there are creators out there like that who, if they want to do, say, historical period piece, they may feel intimidated, by that. But here you're showing it doesn't have to be like that. You can have a, different approach to that, and I think that's something that's challenging genres. Like anybody who writes in a certain genre, it can be challenged. It can be presented in a different way. It doesn't have to be, in the same old mold and follow the, same literary conventions, and that so many people say you have to follow. Like the people who write historical says, oh, you must have every fact right, or you have to focus on pardon me, you have to focus on these small details. You're saying, you know, um, it is part of that, but make it, if you want to make it more about the character, by all means,
Hmm.
make it more character driven, make it more flow of consciousness. And I think that's wonderful that, creators can have that kind of liberty, and we should take those liberties and challenge literary genres.
I agree. Totally.
Yes, yes. So, is there anything that you'd like to, impart to your audience about any further developments, or any, parting words of advice to anybody who wants to take a different approach to, like, a certain genre, like say they want to take a more modern approach to historical fiction?
I think in general, creators should keep in mind what they want to achieve and that, there's many ways to basically write things. Genres are basically just kind of like marketing. It's just a label they slap on to say, yeah, your work fits in this box approximately, but you don't have to be limited by that box. In reality, I think most works are a blend of all genres, not just one.
That's a wonderful I mean that's a perfect summary. Like you just said, every work is a blend of different genres. And I think many creators need to, maybe consider that rather than, feel confined to write a story. And I think it limits the story. Do you think it limits the story when a creator just thinks of something solely in the terms of one genre, like when they're writing something?
I don't really think so, but it can limit the creative process. I mean, there are works that solely fit under one genre, but it's debatable because I can't read the creator's mind whether the creator was only thinking about falling under that genre when writing that genre.
Right, right. So this has been a very rewarding interview. Is there anything else that you'd like to impart to the audience in this interview?
I would just say that in general, just keep an open mind. Even with a genre you think that is really hard to write or very intimidating to start out writing, just think about how you would like to approach it personally and how you can contribute to this genre by, just incorporating what you want into it. Because,
Ex-
yeah, because I think in general, creating a work is just basically expressing yourself.
Right, right, exactly, exactly. And I think that's something you're very right about. As you said, it's very important for creators to have the focus on what they want to achieve. What's the end game of what they want to achieve with their expression? I suppose one last question is not so much an afterthought, but something I was going to ask before. Um, when you're researching something very niche, I mean, what would be the best place to find the resources for that? I think we discussed it a little bit in our previous podcast, but how did you approach it? Like, where were the places that you found your resources?
For the most part, I found my resources through academic journals. And I started also like looking through um, literary critiques of books that are kind of related to the time period I was reading about. Even though, for example, Duddy Kravitz and a lot of Philip Roth's books take place later in the 20th century, there are some similarities because, it talks about, immigrant culture and like the use of the Yiddish language that I found were really useful in constructing Sam's Lower East Side. So I referred to those like literary critiques of those works. And from there, I was reading the literary articles in the bibliographies of those. There were many links to other stuff as well.
That's very good advice. That's very good advice. So how would people access these academic resources? Like, would they have to have an account with the university, or are these, readily available as long as you know where to search? Or are there any specific sites that you can refer to?
There was that site academia.org, or is it academia.com?
I believe it's .org, I think.
Yeah, that one. There's a lot of free stuff on there. And I think just go on Google Scholar. They have a lot
Right,
of links to different things, even like
right,
abstracts. I can't read the whole article, but the abstract is really helpful.
right, right. Would you, I mean, I guess this has already been something everyone's discussed since 2010, but um, if people go to like read Wikipedia articles, but if they go to look at the source and they try to track down that source, can they use that as kind of like a stepping stone into further research?
I definitely think so. I
Right,
have
right.
used it on certain occasions.
Okay, that's great because I know a lot of people rely on it because it's just like a it's like the fastest way to find down, track down a source. So it's wonderful to hear that kind of confirmation, from a creator as yourself who's, really been immersed in the academic research and everything. That's an acceptable way to track down something very quickly.
Hmm. And there's
Right.
also like I think it just goes for whatever you're looking for. I mean, for your time period, it would be a lot harder to find because it's so far from our own, right? Like, for example,
Right.
Imperial Russia, there were no recordings or vinyls or anything back then. But
Right. Yeah.
for Sam in New York, I've been finding a lot of, songs from the 1920s. Aaron Lebedev, he was a Yiddish performer, and I was looking up all the lyrics and all the songs he was singing, and some of them were about Odessa, interestingly enough. So I found out, for example, through listening to Aaron Lebedev, that most people in the Lower East Side who were in the Yiddish theater as actors actually hailed from Romania and Odessa. So I actually picked the right place for Sam's parents to immigrate from.
Gosh, that's amazing. And it's amazing how you were able to find out that tidbit of information, from something like that, like from, songs and recordings and such that that are available.
Mm-hmm. And there were
Yeah.
also another like collection of oral histories that's also on YouTube. Basically, it's like I forgot what it's called, the Gevo, I think, but they're basically based in America, and they basically interview a lot of people from around the world who remember using Yiddish as their first language.
Wow. That's a very remarkable resource. I mean, that's like a gold mine right there.
Yeah, like, we have the experiences of people from Russia. There's this guy from Texas. They're mostly older, right? And some of them don't really speak Yiddish anymore, except for a few words, but they remember their parents or their grandparents speaking it. So, I get a little bit of insight into Sam's world that way.
Oh my, that's absolutely wonderful. And it kind of shows that, when we do research, we're kind of able to, find more human connection essentially, through these common, human experiences.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, I think at this point, so are there any other parting words that you'd like to give to your audience before we conclude the interview?
I think that's it.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Fortunist Games. It was wonderful to have this conversation with you, to learn about all these different approaches and, challenging and expanding genres, as well as, the challenges of, research and such and how to balance that. So thank you so much for this conversation, for sharing the experience and everything. And thank you so much for this fantastic conversation and interview.
Thank you so much, Tete.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Well, see you again in the next podcast then.
See you.
See
Thanks.
you. Bye.
Bye.